Thank you so much for the invitation to present. So the seminar that I'm going to give today will be exploring regulatory barriers to collaborative housing, and it draws on work from both my PhD dissertation that was on housing experiments, and also the report that Prini mentioned, which is actually out, and I will shamelessly plug that at the end of the presentation. And that report was produced with the assistance of a design thinking grant from the Alice Swain Foundation. So I'm very thankful to the ASF for supporting my work, especially during a time when it's a precariously employed scholar. And so I really thank them for the support that they give to early career researchers. So, just to reiterate, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Bidjigal people today, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My sincere thanks also to the people who participated both in my PhD research and in the work for the Alice. Okay, so as part of the solution to the housing affordability crisis around the world, there's been a strong call for greater innovation and diversity in housing, be that new typologies, new models of ownership. And I just want to preface before I start the seminar that being innovative is very much sort of jurisdictionally dependent. So what might be a standard or long-standing maybe housing typology in one jurisdiction might be new to another. So, you know, when I talk about something being innovative, it might be innovative to that particular jurisdiction rather than something that we've never sort of thought of before. People are looking for alternatives to help them address a range of issues, not just affordability, but also sustainability and social inclusion. And for those who want to live more collaboratively, a more shared kind of life, they find the current planning system really unsupportive of that vision that they have for housing. And this quote that I've put up on that slide there, I think really kind of reiterates it sort of summarizes what I think of when I'm thinking about, is the planning system really allowing people to do what they want with their housing? It says life can be very isolating, it can be alienating. Our planning laws currently reinforce those sorts of trends in society. We are told that we must be self-reliant. We are told that we must have our own kitchen, our own full range of facilities, so that we are not reliant on other people. That may suit some people, but it does not suit everybody. Flattening me a little bit, sorry. That was a quote. So why specifically collaborative housing? On the slide, they've said that it's an emerging model, but now on reflection, I don't think that's necessarily true. I would say that it's a model that we're kind of familiar with, and it's sort of picking up interest in sort of speed. Interest in collaborative housing is certainly on the up. It's an umbrella term for types of housing where there's collective ownership, collective management, and the sharing of spaces. Louise Crabtree-Hayes' Glossary of Community-Led Housing is a brilliant paper that sort of looks at those different nuances between those different types of housing if you're looking for a source. And the work by Jasmine Palmer and Ludwig Tummers, their primer on the different roles of collaborative housing, I think that's also an excellent source, and I put a couple of quotes there from them. So, So how did I sort of get onto this topic? The examination of these regulatory barriers to collaborative housing wasn't the focus of my PhD. It was actually an unexpected finding from my PhD interviews. For the PhD, I was really interested in examining if housing policy experiments were a productive method to generating housing system change. And just to go back to that I just wanted to talk about quickly the theoretical framework for that PhD, because I think it kind of helps explain how I got to where I am now. So I used three different scholarly areas to frame my work. So the Innovative Urban Governance Scholarship, so that work by McGurk, Pauline and her colleagues, Robin Dowling, Sophia Martin and Todd Baker, looking at that sort of experimental mood that was happening and sort of really ramped up with government after COVID-19. I used Molson's work on the urban hack, so looking at how hacking helps us to understand how there might be existing flaws in different systems and specifically housing. And then also Nicole Gurin's work, big body of work about the warnings about these sort of claims of innovation and whether, government sort of announcing things that are innovative, are they actually making any wider housing reform, or they're there to sort of placate or possibly distract us from what's going on. So alongside that by the end of the presentation. Alongside a literature review and policy review of all the statewide housing strategies, I also used a comparative case study approach as part of my research. So the 3 case studies that were identified were the Demonstration Housing Project, which is the Commonwealth Project, which introduced new housing typologies to the ACT, the Future Homes Project from Victoria, so a state level project, basically introducing a fast-tracked exemplar design process for specific designs. And they were looking particularly at 3-story apartments. And then the Alternative Housing Ideas Challenge, which was a local government example from the City of Sydney. Wanting to look at broad ideas around affordable housing, council needed new ways to provide affordable housing that didn't rely on the sale of or subsidy of land. So specifically to look at the collaborative housing thing, that came from the Demonstration Housing Project also. So looking at the Demonstration Housing Project just really quickly, it was launched in 2017, and actually all 3 case studies that I had were impacted by the COVID-19 in terms of government delays, change of government focus, rightly so, of course. So that project is still going on at the moment. It was basically established to test new housing ideas in the main residential zone in the ACT, the RZ1. About 80% of ACT's residential land is zoned RZ1. So it's a really big portion of the land that they were trying to experiment with in terms of new housing typologies. Some of the typologies that they looked at, as I said at the beginning, innovation is very jurisdictionally sort of dependent. So co-housing, manor houses, which in other jurisdictions, people may already have, and then designs focus on aging in place. So I guess the question would be, why would government put together something like the Demonstration Housing Project when they already have the power to change planning laws, like just do a sort of government reform? Talking with one of the ACT Legislative Assembly members, this is a quote from them. So in my innocence, I thought, let us organise a demonstration housing project so people could see different things. They could see what was built and just, in the next door suburb, probably in the RZ1 area. And this looks the same as other houses. You can tell it's a new one, but it's about what's actually really there. That was the idea behind it. So basically, in this particular example, the government was sort of slowing down rather than changing the planning system to allow this new housing type immediately. They wanted to hopefully build an exemplar of each of these new typologies. They were going to have open days and people would actually experience what it felt like to have those new typologies come and be sited around the suburbs, that they lived in, and then for people to be able to comment and make that sort of informed decision about whether they were interested in introducing these typologies. So while looking at that case study, it unexpectedly revealed to me the sort of tension between when you've got a formal planning policy review and an experimental policy process. Because while the Demonstration Housing Project was going on, the ACT government brought in a new bill and a new territory plan. So you had sort of the collision of the traditional planning reforms with an experimental process. And specifically, I wanted to look at that by next project in the area of co-housing. Co-housing in this context is a type of housing that's driven by individuals and groups. So my focus is not on the new generation boarding houses or co-living that we have in New South Wales. It's more about those formations of grassroots groups that want to develop co-housing to live as a community. So I put in an application to the Alistair Swain Foundation for this specific project, and we've just wrapped that up and the report is live now. So why did I want to look specifically at co-housing? As I mentioned, co-housing was one of the typologies that they brought through in the demonstration housing project, but also co-housing is on the rise. There's more interest in it. People are wanting to form communities together. I've heard people talk about, wanting to age in place with their mates from uni. Like that's, the kind of thing behind it. But co-housing is not one particular form or format. It's really, really diverse. So when looking at the planning policy to support co-housing, I was also conscious that, while definition and things like that are important in the planning system, making those definitions too tight can then also stop people from developing the specific type of community that they would want. So for those not familiar, co-housing in Australia, communities tend to be quite small, less than 50 households. Each household will have their own separate dwelling, which, could be a house, it could be a townhouse, a villa, apartment, whatever it might be. Those tend to be grouped around some common facilities. Those shared or common facilities often include an indoor space, which might be called the shared or common house, and it might include a kitchen and dining area for communal meals, lounge, meeting area. But again, everything, because it's sort of designed from, the people, the members of that community that are developing it, each co-housing community can look a little bit different, and what kind of shared facilities that particular group might like will differ, to the next co-housing community. It's really based around the idea that there's going to be sharing of not only your facilities, your activities, but also your responsibilities. So it's a little bit different to say just your traditional unit titling or strata titling like that. People are much more involved in the direction of how those communities are going to be managed and what they actually do day to day. Research has shown that co-housing communities are shown to enhance sustainability practices. So have a look at Matt Daly's work and also health benefits. So the methods for this particular project, I did pre-interview planning policy reviews. I needed to look at some of the planning documents to form my themes and sort of main questions. Identified that there were 4 particular case studies in the ACT that I could look at. 2 were historical, Arambi Village and Waivialana Grove, but I decided to focus on the 2 newer co-housing communities in the ACT, so that's Stellulata and then the North Watson group as well. I did interviews with those co-housing stakeholders, and then out of those interviews, when they started to talk to me about some of the other regulatory barriers, the historic problems that they kind of face, I needed to then go back and look further back in the planning policy history, and then also look at different regulatory areas, so construction code and ownership structures. So that's the list of policies that I looked at. Don't worry, we are not going to go through each of those one by one. That's what the report is for. But there's 2 in particular that we're going to look at today. So the first one is actually looking at the project that is part of the demonstration housing project. So to actually have one of those demonstration housing projects built, those participants needed to firstly get a variation to the territory plan to actually allow that type of housing to be built, because it wasn't allowed in the current territory plan. That was the whole purpose of having this sort of experimental process. Then they would move on to the traditional more development application side. But first, they needed to be able to change the zoning and the allowances for that type to be able to happen. So in this example, this is changing the territory plan to allow firstly co-housing as a housing type to actually exist in that zone. And again, it's only changing the territory plan for that one lot. So it's quite an involved process on the government's side to want to do this sort of experimentation and go through this sort of statutory framework channels to be able to do that. The other thing that it allowed was to have unit titling in RZ1 that previously wasn't allowed. Once a territory plan came in, which we'll talk about in a minute, that has been allowed, but that was another change that needed to happen. And the third thing that the variation allowed was parking requirements. So rather than having each car space sort of next to each individual unit, co-housing, they wanted to share 2 electric vehicles. So for them, they wanted to be able to have those vehicles sort of grouped on one side of the lot. and then use, the additional space that would be given for parking for other things like garden and things like that. So that was another variation that they needed to have. Then they went through the normal development assessment process after this. So then when it came to the territory plan in 2023, the big things that territory plan brought in was, for the first time, it had a definition of what co-housing was in the ACT. So that's a big thing. Not every jurisdiction in Australia has a definition of co-housing. Some have co-living, some have tied it together with other types of housing, but now in the ACT they do have a definition of co-housing. And they've said that it means a development with separate dwellings or private living areas with some common and shared indoor components such as kitchens, living areas, bathrooms, and laundries. Private areas must each contain a bedroom or bathroom, and as a minimum may contain a kitchenette. Common shared indoor components may be provided in a separate building. So while that sounds quite broad, we haven't tested that with other co-housing communities to see whether that would actually fit what they would like to achieve with there. So that's something to think about. Co-housing under the new territory plan is now also allowed in zones 2, 3, 4, residential zones 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it's still not allowed under the territory plan in RZ1. So that one block is still the only block in the RZ1 that's allowed to do co-housing. And as I said before, with 80% of the land zone, residential land zoned RZ1, it's a huge potential, for co-housing to flourish if it was allowed in that RZ1. And then the minimum block size, Stellulata co-housing community was developed on a block that was 1,090 metres squared. So they changed that to allow the minimum block size to be a little bit smaller now for co-housing. But again, your net's still limited by the zone, which makes things kind of tricky. They also brought in those lower parking requirements, and they kind of reflect what had happened in Stellulata. So while that's good, because most co-housing communities don't want as much parking as a traditional sort of residential development, because they want to be able to use it for other purposes, that land. Again, that hasn't been tested with every kind of co-housing community, so I'd be interested to see whether those lower parking requirements, match the vision of some of those other co-housing. So then, in summary, where we are today, the planning barriers are still whether that definition really suits every co-housing community. The zoning is still restricted, which is a problem. And then also block size. What about having much smaller co-housing communities and much smaller blocks? So those are not out. While I was finishing up the report, the ACT government decided that they would release a draft missing middle planning reform. So that was May. It was a few weeks before I was supposed to be wrapping up this particular piece of research. So I quickly included that in the report because I thought it was interesting to see what they were doing. So they released the draft major plan amendment to the territory plan, missing middle housing reform, residential zones and subdivision policy. So taking some time to go through that and try and understand what changes they were going to make under that missing middle reform. And I should say it's still draft. The submissions closed about 10 days ago. I'd like to go and have a look and see what people have said, but I haven't had time yet. So this is all very live and still going on in the ACT. The two things that jumped out to me in terms of progressing things for co-housing were that zoning would be allowed in the RZ1 zone if these amendments were to be passed, which is huge. And then also they would allow co-housing to occur on the small blocks. So I guess watch this space, wait and see what's going to happen. But just in that time period, you can, if we go back to the slide that had all the I think I'm having some trouble with the button sticking on the Twitter. I'm really sorry to anyone. If you need to shut your eyes just to. We might not try and go back then. But anyway, but if you look in the report, there's a list of all the different things, different reforms that have gone on. You can see how things have changed over time. So things have certainly moved on from the sort of housing choices, things that I looked at in 2017 in the ACT, but that it is 2025 now. We're still now having a new set of reforms. So, and that's just for one. Like I'm only looking at one particular housing typology. So it would be interesting to expand it to other typologies. So then the other main part of the report was looking at what those other regulatory barriers are. So as much as as a former government planner, we sort of think we're really good at writing statutory planning instruments. We've thought of all the possibilities that could happen. Everything's going to sort of, go through quite smoothly in the development application process. There are other regulatory areas that need to be considered. And I think, interestingly, the demonstration housing project really shows that, Mileson's idea that the HAT can help to reveal these gaps. I think this case study sort of really provide some empirical data to show that that actually does happen. Both the planning and construction regulations really struggle to understand that form and function of the common house. And I've got a couple of quotes that I'll show in a moment that talk about that problem. So that shared space by the community. Go to the first. So this is from one of the co-housing communities, the one who was going through the demonstration housing project. Basically, the quote is sort of talking about they're going through the territory plan variation process. They're applying to have the 3 dwellings built in the RZ1 zone. But then when it comes closer to the time of doing the development assessment, once they start to look at the actual plans under the building code, because in the shared house they wanted to have bathroom and a bedroom so that guests from any of the co-housing units could come and stay. That's now being classified as a dwelling. So they've got a territory plan variation for 3 dwellings, but under the building code, they're looking at that set of plans now and saying that's 4 dwellings. But that hadn't really sort of been realised at the time when the planning reforms were going through. So that was one interesting sort of finding, and also very difficult for those particular proponents to have lived through that, the time delays that it takes to go through not only a territory plan review, but then also development application to then come to that conclusion. And then the second one, so this has been talking to the department. For example, our co-housing proponents were not intending to have laundries in each of their homes, but rather have a shared laundry. However, they've already had to revise their plans to include a laundry because under the BCA, they would have been classed as a boarding house if they didn't have a laundry, which on the side has a whole heap of additional like fire rating and that sort of requirements and things like that. So that's what the further implications they're talking about. So Building Code of Australia is nothing that I have any influence over. So this is talking to someone who's actually running the demonstration housing project, because that's for the whole of Australia. So if we want to change things beyond, there's further work we need to do at a national level. So again, it's not until they started to put sort of experimental process into play that these sorts of conflicts sort of reveal themselves. Then talking about ownership structures. So I mentioned at the beginning that the idea of co-housing or collaborative housing is that you really want to share, facilities, but also the way that the community is particularly governed. While unit titling is one option, company title is another way that residents can sort of better control the types of objectives that they want to have, and also the type of people who might share that sort of vision when the original inhabitants sort of change. So the things that I found that were the main ownership issues that occur with ownership structures if you're using company title rather than unit titling that weren't really foreseen is finance can be a major issue. So if you're in a unit titling structure, the process of my individual unit needing to take out a mortgage, the next individual unit needing to take out a mortgage is quite clear. But if you're using company title to do that, it then becomes that the entire company might need to, become a guarantor of that loan and things like that. And that becomes really complicated when you've got, potentially a lot of people who do need to take out a mortgage. I'm not sure that there's that many people who are going into this sort of thing who won't need to take on some sort of loan. So that's an unexpected sort of regulatory barrier that can catch co-housing communities kind of unaware. Utility sharing. So with the idea that they would be sustainable, the idea of having shared solar power, shared rainwater tanks, and then shared metering of utilities is really problematic because around the country, most new like strata units or unit titles, they need to have individual metering. So that idea that you would be able to share some sort of metering system, especially if you're getting benefits from having shared solar power and shared water, that, again, that sort of sharing idea that comes into conflict there. People want to share, but the systems don't really look at that. So me getting to look at the sort of technical regulations around utilities in the ACT. That wasn't an area that I necessarily expected I'd be going into, but that was something that I looked at as part of this report. And then the final one in the ACT, and again, these are only ACT sort of specific. If I start to look at other jurisdictions around Australia, other things are or not. So the land tax was the last one. So in the ACT, land tax exemptions apply when a property is being used as a primary dwelling. But if you're under company title, you don't have access to that particular residential exemption. So they may ask you to pay land tax even though you are using, those homes as your primary dwelling. So whether a new category of exemption could be allowed or things like that. But again, it's not been really tested, but it's something that could be an issue in the future. So then, in conclusion, despite the planning sort of system changes to allow this new type of housing to occur, there's still other areas of reform that need to happen to allow different types of co-housing to sort of thrive. We need to think beyond planning when putting forward plans to think about housing diversity and things like that, because as that quote said, the BCA or National Construction Code with the BCA chapter, it covers the whole of Australia. So we're going to get that level of conflict everywhere. And it's not just for co-housing, other types of collaborative housing or other types of housing models might also run into that as well. But again, it's sort of untested. But now I think with this research, we're starting to think, okay, there could be other things that we're going to sort of need to pull out to allow these things to happen. In particular, I think that sharing is not really very well understood by the planning and other regulatory areas. That's sort of a problem because going right back to that first quote, might suit some people, but it doesn't sort of suit everyone. And there are impacts to then other forms of collaborative housing, community-led housing and things like that. If co-housing is experiencing this, then they may also run into those same type of things. So the larger move towards collaborative housing has some problems. So I think the session's been recorded, so you'll be able to access the slides and the slide decks. I've put together either a list of the people that I've referenced, but also there's a couple in there that I think people might just find interesting if this is sort of the topic that we're tonight. And then the final slide. So plugging the report. This went up last week, which I'm really, really excited that sort of the seminar and the report happened to go in time. So please read, if you want to go and look at all those housing policies that I listed, that's where you'll find them. So thank you all so much.
Shouldn't we check folks?
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to start with that one. What is the significance and driving force to focus on co-housing to offer housing choice or diversity within the spectrum of housing types, or a vehicle for housing affordability, which is not specifically the outcome? There are potential financial or funding issues for such projects from traditional financial institutions like banks, perhaps like or dissimilar to cooperative housing. it seems some of the planning regulatory barriers are reflective of the risk aversion and conservatism of planners. Why can't building codes respond to this type?
I feel like there's a couple of things, so I might unpack that. Thank you so much, Carl. I'm not sure if you meant whether that was my choice to focus on it, or whether there's just a general choice to focus on co-housing. For me, it was just something that came up as a part of my case studies, but I think in general, people are interested in having that sort of community experience of their housing. They don't want to necessarily, again, it's different people want different things. Some people like the idea of having that community right there with them, sharing resources, raising children sort of together, supporting each other as they age in place. I think if that's what, Carl, you mean, like, I think that's why people are sort of interested in it, why we're seeing it sort of becoming more popular. Within the spectrum of housing types of people, it can be more affordable depending on the site, like the way that the particular structure is laid out, because you might be sharing some facilities, you might be sharing transport, you might be sharing laundries. There's a tendency to not maybe have a 2 or 3 bedroom unit, but maybe a 2-bedroom unit because you have a spare bedroom in the common house. Like it can be more affordable, but it's not necessary. It kind of depends on, what the particular co-housing community wants to do, and also where it's going to be located in terms of land costs and things like that. I suppose the planning system is maybe it hasn't really thought about those sort of more shared structures, even though we probably think that's a more traditional way of sort of living and things like that. I think that maybe, it is a sort of thing that we need to talk to, building code and national construction code and things like that, if we're going to see more and more of this type of, I don't know how to do that, but yeah.
Yep. Hey, thanks for those comments.
Susan in the room.
Yeah, oh, Laura, thanks so much for such an interesting talk and really great research. And I couldn't help, or just jumped into my head, thinking about when you said co-housing is variously defined and has lots and lots of different forms. Did you go back to the housing in the so-called communes in the sort of the living up on the north coast? I mean, this is going back probably, I don't know, 50s, 60s. And I can recall Cole James over at Sydney Uni did enormous amount of work around that, and he was battling, I think, the building codes or regulations around the problems of allowing people to live together in in sort of cooperative formats in housing, but they weren't complying certainly with the building codes at the time. And so I wonder, if your work sort of does include that sort of development, if it does, or even if it doesn't, what do you think we can learn from those early sort of examples? And no doubt there's even earlier ones, and that we can bring to today's discussion.
I didn't look specifically at any historical ones, so the historical ones that I have in this research are from the 1970s. But as you say, like co-housing or that kind of communal living has existed for a long time, and they continue to exist sort of informally outside that particular planning system. So I think, that would be interesting for me to understand how that got through, because people certainly can achieve a sort of co-housing environment through the normal means, whether that's you have a duplex and then you put a granny flat and then you sort of work it out. Like that can sort of happen as well. So I think it would be interesting, as you say, to go back and have a look at some of those, how they sort of worked around the planning and building controls to be able to do that. Because I think people are still doing that now.
Well, yeah, but I mean, a lot of them didn't survive, you know, and that would also be interesting. I'm sure that's been written about, and but maybe that wasn't so much associated with the regulatory processes and governance, but it'd be interesting to know.
I think, yeah,
what it was.
the age of the community and as
Yeah.
those sorts of change and that
Sure.
original dynamic
Yeah,
energy
yeah,
as that changes as people
yeah,
move out, new
yeah.
people come in. I think that's what you're sort of talking about.
Yeah.
I would definitely suggest looking at some of, again, Louise Crabtree's work in that area, Jasmine Palmer as well. And then also I know there's a new Ahuri research project led by Wendy Stone. I'm really excited to see
Oh, okay.
what the results of that.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah.
Thanks, Susan. That's what
Thanks,
things to
Lauren.
think about.
Right.
We have just another comment from Carl. The only way it would become more widely accepted is to ensure those that are entering into co-housing arrangements can achieve both an affordable housing option for perpetuity and potential future equity from capital growth to move up through the housing spectrum. Just false. It has to be incentivized.
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if people necessarily who are entering co-housing are necessarily thinking especially about the potential future equity necessarily. They seem, when I talk to them, to be more interested in that community, that sense of community and things like that. And also if you're buying something into that's, company title, you're not necessarily going to pass it down to your children in the same way that, other projects might do. But that's really interesting. I think I'll have to think about that.
I think the comment on that is that in Australia, traditionally, we've had a very, call it a capitalistic approach to property and residential property and ownership. And you raised the things like company title versus strata titling and those sort of things. So we've almost wedged ourselves in a position that anything outside that ideology is quite foreign.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's what creates a lot of the issues with regards to
Yeah.
planning code and the construction code and various other things, because we're not attuned to community housing, if you
So, Peter, do you think we need another ownership structure maybe?
Well, you can talk to Michael Tees about strata titling and that sort of stuff. Yeah, I don't know if we need to relax it more or tighten it more, but I think it's more of an ideology. I think, we're always talking about things like housing affordability. There's no such thing as housing affordability, certainly in New South Wales, Sydney. But we sort of latch onto these sort of concepts, and as you say, this is just another option. But I think the variation to the themes, as you've mentioned, Laura, creates, from a legislative position, a real difficulty because you can't cover everything, as you say.
Yeah.
They haven't even covered it in RZ1 zone in Canberra, and they've got to create all these isolated incidents. That creates just a nightmare, I think.
I think I was kind of thinking that the main barrier would be the planning system and this planning system only, that it would only be zoning, or it would only be block size, it would only be parking or whatever. But now there's all these additional layers, and that's just co-housing in the ACT. What about other housing typologies in the ACT? What if I look at co-housing in other jurisdictions as well? So I think, Caitlin?
Can I ask if there's a particular demographic or sort of lifestyle that is in demand of this in particular, or if there are a couple of different types of groups that you might have come across, and if there are different regulatory barriers associated with their vision of what they want?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So
Does that change state by state? Because you can probably Canberra, New South Wales.
So in terms of, it almost is like different types of co-housing communities. So you might have people who are sort of more towards the end of their working age or something like that and wanting to form a community where they want to be able to support each other as they continue to age and things like that. So they tend to be a lot smaller and in terms of the regulatory barriers, I suppose because they're small, they're very conscious about what's going to happen when ownership sort of changes. If you've got a much larger sort of development, if one particular group changes and they're not that interested in being part of the daily running of the cohort, the sort of balance of people who are interested will sort of balance out. But if you've only got 2 or 3 sort of households within there, that is often when they go to something like your company title, because they want to be able to have those kind of agreements about what is expected, what does it mean to participate, and all those sorts of things. So you're right, there is a difference there. Then the larger co-housing communities where, in the ACT where it was more, I'm thinking of the historic ones now, it was more about community living and things like that, and they were happy to use this unit titling or strata titling to manage the way that they were going to do that. And maybe they've just got a particularly active, executive committee or something like that, or maybe into their, maybe into their bylaws, they could write something that was a little bit more restrictive and things like that. So you're right, it definitely changes on the size of things. I haven't looked at, there are a lot of emerging communities, and I'm interested to see Wendy Stone and her team's research on that, because they're actually going out, they have the capacity and the size of the team to actually go and interview a lot more of those communities. I'm really interested to see what that does. And then there's also work that's been done, surveys asking people, I'm thinking of Co-Housing Australia, they had run a previous survey about people who were either in co-housing or wanted to start it, and what the kind of drivers were, and certainly goals about shared living experience, sustainability, and just that kind of lifestyle seem to be the main drivers for those. Well,
Sorry, but I think I saw a documentary a few years ago. It was about Blues Point Tower.
Yeah.
And the laundry, I think, is on the top level.
Yes, that's right. It is.
And so everyone can join the laundry, and they said it's the best views in Sydney.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Karen mentioned in the chat that Stucco in Sydney is a great cooperative housing example. So again, from Karen's example, you have cooperative housing that exists in Sydney, but you don't have a definition of that in New South Wales. Or they brought in the co-living definition as part of the new housing set and things like that, but we don't actually have one for co-housing. Yeah. Thanks, Karen.
Any other questions? No? Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you so much, everyone.